Question 1. The efficiency study reveals that a large-scale cotton farm in Alabama is considering significant operational adjustments in response to emerging climate change legislation. The farm manager is seeking advice on how to best adapt their practices to comply with new state-level environmental mandates and potentially access associated incentives. Which of the following approaches represents the most prudent and legally sound strategy for the farm? Option A. Focus solely on adopting voluntary sustainability certifications and best practices that are not directly tied to specific Alabama climate change legislation, assuming these will satisfy any future regulatory expectations. Option B. Implement changes based on widely published international climate adaptation strategies without verifying their specific applicability or compliance with Alabama state law. Option C. Proactively consult with the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries, ADI, and relevant federal agencies to understand specific legislative requirements and available support programs for climate-smart agriculture, ensuring operational changes align with state mandates and leverage incentives. Option D. Prioritize immediate cost reductions by deferring any investments in new equipment or practices that are not strictly mandated by current enforceable regulations, while continuing existing reporting procedures. Correct answer is C. Proactively consult with the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries, ADI, and relevant federal agencies to understand specific legislative requirements and available support programs for climate-smart agriculture, ensuring operational changes align with state mandates and leverage incentives. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a critical juncture for Alabama agricultural operations as they navigate the evolving landscape of climate change legislation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires agricultural producers and their advisors to balance traditional farming practices with new regulatory requirements, often involving significant investment and operational adjustments. The challenge lies in interpreting and implementing complex, often nascent, climate-related laws and incentives in a way that is both compliant and economically viable. Careful judgment is required to assess the long-term implications of these legislative changes on crop yields, resource management, and market access. The most effective approach involves proactively engaging with the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries, ADI, and relevant federal agencies to understand the specific mandates and available support programs related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. This includes seeking guidance on best practices for soil health improvement, water conservation, and greenhouse gas emission reduction, as outlined or encouraged by Alabama's environmental regulations and agricultural policies. This proactive engagement ensures that operational changes are aligned with legal requirements and can leverage available incentives, such as grants for adopting climate-smart technologies or tax credits for implementing sustainable land management practices. This approach is correct because it prioritizes compliance with Alabama's specific regulatory framework and ethical responsibility to steward agricultural resources sustainably, as increasingly emphasized by state and federal agricultural policy. An approach that focuses solely on immediate cost savings by ignoring new environmental reporting requirements under Alabama's climate initiatives would be professionally unacceptable. This failure to comply with reporting mandates, which are often precursors to or components of broader climate legislation, could lead to penalties, loss of eligibility for future programs, and reputational damage. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to implement changes based on general climate science without consulting specific Alabama legislation or ADI guidance. While general knowledge is useful, it does not guarantee compliance with state-specific laws, which may have unique thresholds, reporting mechanisms, or incentive structures. This could result in ineffective or non-compliant practices. Finally, an approach that relies exclusively on voluntary industry best practices without considering the legal obligations imposed by Alabama's climate change legislation is insufficient. While voluntary measures are often encouraged, they do not absolve producers of their legal responsibilities under enacted laws and regulations. Failure to integrate legal requirements with voluntary efforts could lead to non-compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific climate change legislation applicable in Alabama. This involves consulting official state and federal agricultural and environmental agency resources, seeking expert legal and technical advice, and engaging in dialogue with regulatory bodies. The framework should then assess the operational and economic impacts of these regulations, identify opportunities for compliance and improvement, and prioritize actions that align with both legal mandates and long-term sustainability goals. Question 2. The evaluation methodology shows that a prospective buyer is considering purchasing a large tract of undeveloped land in rural Alabama for the purpose of establishing a commercial blueberry farm. Before finalizing the purchase, the buyer wants to ensure that their intended agricultural use is legally permissible and will not be subject to unexpected restrictions. What is the most prudent and legally sound course of action for the buyer to take in Alabama to confirm the permissibility of their planned agricultural operation? Option A. Proceed with the purchase and begin site preparation, assuming that local zoning will accommodate typical farming operations. Option B. Rely on a verbal assurance from the current landowner that the land has historically been used for agricultural purposes and that there are no known issues. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the property's deed, title, insurance policy, and any recorded covenants or restrictions to identify any limitations on land use. Option D. Assume that any agricultural use is permitted in Alabama unless specifically prohibited by state environmental regulations. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the property's deed, title, insurance policy, and any recorded covenants or restrictions to identify any limitations on land use. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that navigating property law in agricultural contexts in Alabama presents unique challenges due to the interplay of traditional property rights, agricultural use, and evolving environmental regulations. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to balance the rights of landowners with the sustainable use of land and compliance with state statutes. The best approach involves a thorough examination of the existing deed restrictions and covenants associated with the agricultural land in Alabama. This includes verifying the legal descriptions, understanding the scope and enforceability of any limitations on land use, and confirming that the proposed agricultural activity does not violate these recorded instruments. This method is correct because Alabama property law, like in most jurisdictions, gives significant weight to the terms of deeds and covenants as legally binding agreements that define property rights and restrictions. Adherence to these recorded documents ensures legal compliance and prevents future disputes or legal challenges from neighboring landowners or previous grantors who may have retained certain rights or imposed limitations. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on verbal agreements or informal understandings with the seller regarding the use of the land. This is professionally unacceptable because verbal agreements concerning real property rights are generally not enforceable under Alabama's statute of frauds, which requires contracts for the sale or transfer of an interest in land to be in writing. Such an approach risks significant legal entanglements and financial loss if the seller or their heirs later assert rights contrary to the informal agreement. Another incorrect approach is to assume that any use of land for agriculture is permissible as long as it is not explicitly prohibited by state law. This is professionally unsound because it ignores the possibility of private restrictions imposed by deed or covenant, which can be more stringent than state regulations. Alabama law recognizes the right of landowners to create and enforce such restrictions, and failing to investigate them can lead to violations of private property rights and potential litigation. Finally, an incorrect approach is to proceed with the agricultural development based on a general understanding of typical farming practices without investigating specific local zoning ordinances or agricultural district regulations in the relevant Alabama county. While general knowledge is helpful, specific local regulations can impose unique requirements, setbacks, or prohibitions that must be adhered to. Ignoring these specific local rules can result in fines, stop work orders, or the inability to operate the agricultural enterprise as planned. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive review of all recorded legal documents pertaining to the property, including deeds, plats, and any recorded covenants or restrictions. This should be followed by an investigation of relevant state and local laws, including zoning ordinances and any specific agricultural regulations applicable to the area. Consulting with legal counsel specializing in Alabama property and agricultural law is crucial to ensure full compliance and mitigate potential risks. Question 3. The monitoring system demonstrates a growing concern among Alabama landowners regarding the legal implications of adopting new irrigation technologies and their potential impact on groundwater usage and downstream water rights. Which of the following approaches best reflects a proactive and legally sound strategy for addressing these concerns within the context of Alabama agricultural law? Option A. Assume that federal environmental regulations concerning water usage are comprehensive enough to cover all aspects of irrigation in Alabama, negating the need for specific state-level legal inquiry. Option B. Rely on established farming practices and informal agreements with neighboring landowners regarding water usage, assuming these have always been acceptable in the region. Option C. Prioritize the immediate implementation of the new irrigation technology based on its perceived economic benefits, deferring any legal review until a potential dispute arises. Option D. Proactively research and consult current Alabama statutes and case law pertaining to water rights, groundwater management, and irrigation practices, seeking guidance from legal professionals specializing in Alabama agricultural law to ensure full compliance. The correct answer is D. Proactively research and consult current Alabama statutes and case law pertaining to water rights, groundwater management, and irrigation practices, seeking guidance from legal professionals specializing in Alabama agricultural law to ensure full compliance. Explanation: the monitoring system demonstrates a need for robust agricultural law understanding in modern Alabama society. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating complex state-specific regulations, ethical considerations regarding land use and environmental stewardship, and the economic realities faced by Alabama farmers. A deep understanding of Alabama agricultural law is crucial to ensure compliance, protect agricultural resources, and support the viability of the agricultural sector, which is a cornerstone of the state's economy and heritage. The best approach involves proactively seeking and applying current Alabama agricultural statutes and case law to understand the legal implications of proposed land use changes. This includes consulting with legal counsel specializing in Alabama agricultural law to interpret specific provisions related to water rights, soil conservation, and pesticide application, ensuring all actions align with the Alabama Code and relevant administrative regulations. This approach is correct because it prioritizes legal compliance and informed decision-making, directly addressing the core purpose of agricultural law in safeguarding agricultural practices and resources within the state's legal framework. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or common farming practices prevalent in Alabama, without verifying their legality under current state law. This fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of agricultural regulations and the potential for outdated practices to violate specific Alabama statutes, leading to legal penalties and environmental damage. Another incorrect approach is to assume that federal regulations alone are sufficient to govern agricultural activities in Alabama. While federal laws play a role, Alabama has its own comprehensive body of agricultural law that dictates specific requirements for land use, water management, and environmental protection within the state. Ignoring these state-specific laws constitutes a significant regulatory failure. Finally, an approach that prioritizes short-term economic gains over long-term environmental sustainability and legal compliance is professionally unacceptable. Alabama's agricultural law often balances economic interests with the need for responsible resource management. Disregarding this balance can lead to legal repercussions and damage to the agricultural ecosystem, undermining the very foundation of sustainable farming. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying the specific agricultural activity and its potential legal implications under Alabama law. This involves thorough research of the Alabama Code, relevant administrative rules, and any pertinent judicial decisions. Consulting with legal experts in Alabama agricultural law is paramount to ensure accurate interpretation and application of these laws. This structured approach ensures that decisions are not only economically sound, but also legally compliant and ethically responsible, fostering a sustainable agricultural future for Alabama. Question 4. Process analysis reveals that a landowner in rural Alabama intending to construct a new barn discovers that the proposed building site is located near a long-standing, but infrequently used, gravel path that their neighbor has historically used to access a back pasture. The original deed granting the neighbor's property recorded in 1955, contains a clause stating a perpetual right-of-way for ingress and egress over the existing path for the benefit of the adjoining parcel. The landowner believes the path is no longer essential for the neighbor's current agricultural operations and plans to build the barn, partially encroaching on the edge of the path, assuming the neighbor will not object. What is the most prudent course of action for the landowner in Alabama? Option A. Immediately begin clearing the path and constructing the barn, disregarding the neighbor's historical use, on the grounds that the landowner has superior title to their property and can develop it as they see fit. Option B. Inform the neighbor of the intention to build the barn and offer a small monetary compensation for their inconvenience, assuming this will legally extinguish any potential easement rights they might have. Option C. Proceed with the barn construction as planned, assuming the neighbor's historical use of the path does not constitute a legally enforceable easement under Alabama law due to its infrequent use, and the landowner's belief that it is no longer essential. Option D. Thoroughly review the original deed and any related recorded documents to precisely ascertain the legal description and scope of the right-of-way. And if ambiguity exists or development is planned to impact the path, consult with an Alabama attorney to understand the legal implications and explore options such as formal clarification or negotiation with the neighbor. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly review the original deed and any related recorded documents to precisely ascertain the legal description and scope of the right-of-way. And if ambiguity exists or development is planned to impact the path, consult with an Alabama attorney to understand the legal implications and explore options such as formal clarification or negotiation with the neighbor. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in Alabama agricultural law where a landowner's use of their property may inadvertently infringe upon the established rights of a neighbor, specifically concerning an easement for ingress and egress. The professional challenge lies in balancing the landowner's desire to develop their property with the legal obligation to respect the neighbor's established right-of-way, ensuring compliance with Alabama property law, and preventing potential litigation. Careful judgment is required to identify the precise scope and limitations of the easement, and to implement solutions that are both legally sound and practically feasible. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of the original easement agreement and relevant Alabama case law to precisely define the scope and location of the right-of-way. This approach prioritizes understanding the legal parameters of the easement before undertaking any development. Alabama law, particularly through its codified statutes and judicial precedent, emphasizes the importance of adhering to the terms of written easements. If the easement is clearly defined, the landowner must respect its boundaries and ensure their development does not obstruct or unreasonably interfere with the neighbor's access. If the easement is ambiguous, seeking a declaratory judgment from an Alabama court or engaging in mediated negotiation with the neighbor to clarify or modify the easement would be the legally appropriate next step. This approach directly addresses the legal rights and obligations established by the easement, minimizing the risk of legal disputes and ensuring compliance with Alabama property law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the development based on a subjective interpretation of the easement's intent without consulting the original documentation or seeking legal clarification. This disregards the legal precision required in defining property rights and could lead to a violation of the neighbor's easement rights under Alabama law, potentially resulting in injunctions or damages. Another incorrect approach is to assume the easement has been abandoned or extinguished due to non-use without proper legal determination. Alabama law generally requires specific legal actions, such as adverse possession or a court order, to extinguish an easement, and mere non-use is often insufficient. Proceeding with development under this assumption would be legally precarious. Finally, ignoring the neighbor's concerns and proceeding with construction without any attempt at communication or resolution is professionally irresponsible and legally risky, as it fails to address the potential for a legal challenge to the easement's continued validity or scope. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a systematic decision-making framework. First, gather all relevant documentation, including the original easement agreement and any subsequent amendments or related property deeds. Second, research applicable Alabama statutes and case law pertaining to easements, rights-of-way, and property development. Third, Consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama real estate and property law to interpret the documentation and advise on legal options. Fourth, engage in open and honest communication with the affected neighbor to understand their perspective and explore potential resolutions. Fifth, if agreement cannot be reached, consider formal legal processes such as mediation, arbitration, or litigation to obtain a definitive ruling on the easement's scope and enforceability. Question 5. Governance review demonstrates that a family has been farming a parcel of land in rural Alabama for 3 generations under an informal arrangement, with no formal lease or deed in their name. The current generation wishes to formalize their agricultural operation and seeks advice on their land tenure status. What is the most prudent course of action to ensure compliance with Alabama law and protect their long-term interests? Option A. Advise the family that since there is no formal documentation, they have no legal claim to the land and should focus solely on securing a new lease agreement with the record title holder. Option B. Proceed with informal negotiations with the record title holder to reach a quick agreement, prioritizing immediate operational continuity over a detailed legal assessment of their tenure. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive title search and review all relevant Alabama statutes and case law pertaining to property rights, adverse possession, and prescriptive easements to definitively establish the legal basis of their claim and any existing encumbrances. Option D. Rely on Alabama's Right to Farm Act to protect their current farming activities, assuming this implicitly grants them a right to continue using the land indefinitely. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive title search and review all relevant Alabama statutes and case law pertaining to property rights, adverse possession, and prescriptive easements to definitively establish the legal basis of their claim and any existing encumbrances. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex interplay between historical land tenure practices, current agricultural operations, and the legal framework governing land ownership and use in Alabama. The core issue revolves around distinguishing between outright ownership, usufructuary rights, and potential claims arising from long-standing, informal arrangements. A careful judgment is required to ensure that any proposed action respects established legal rights and avoids creating new liabilities or disputes. The best professional approach involves a thorough legal investigation into the chain of title and any recorded or unrecorded agreements pertaining to the land in question. This includes examining historical deeds, leases, and any evidence of adverse possession or prescriptive easements that might have arisen under Alabama law. Understanding the specific nature of the family arrangement is paramount. It must be assessed against Alabama's statutes and case law concerning property rights, particularly those related to agricultural land. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to Alabama's property law, ensuring that all actions are legally sound and protect the client's interests by clarifying their precise rights and obligations. It directly addresses the potential for unrecorded interests or claims that could impact the land's tenure. An approach that focuses solely on the current occupant's perceived right to farm, without verifying their legal basis, is professionally unacceptable. While Alabama's Right to Farm Act provides protections for agricultural operations, it does not create ownership rights or supersede existing property interests. Relying on this act without a foundational understanding of land tenure would be a significant regulatory failure, potentially leading to legal challenges from rightful landowners or those with established usufructuary rights. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that the absence of formal documentation automatically negates any rights the occupants might possess. Alabama law recognizes various forms of property interests, some of which may not be memorialized in traditional deeds or leases. Ignoring potential claims based on long-standing use or informal agreements, even if not formally recorded, would be an ethical and legal failing. This could lead to disputes and litigation if those occupants have established rights under principles like adverse possession or implied easements. Finally, an approach that prioritizes immediate resolution through informal negotiation without a clear understanding of the legal landscape is also professionally unsound. While mediation can be valuable, it must be informed by a solid grasp of Alabama property law. Proceeding without this legal foundation risks entering into agreements that are not legally binding or that inadvertently cede legitimate rights. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the core legal issue. In this case, it is the precise nature of land tenure and the rights of various parties involved. 2. Gathering all relevant information. This includes historical documents, current usage patterns, and any oral histories or informal agreements. 3. Consulting relevant legal frameworks, specifically Alabama property law, including statutes and case law on land ownership, leases, adverse possession, and prescriptive rights. 4. Analyzing the information against the legal framework, determining the legal standing of each party's claim. 5. Developing legally sound strategies, based on the analysis, advising the client on the best course of action to protect their interests and comply with Alabama law. Question 6. Cost-benefit analysis shows that using a particular pesticide, which is EPA registered, could significantly increase crop yield for a farmer in Limestone County, Alabama. However, the farmer is unsure if the pesticide's application method, as described in the manufacturer's brochure, fully aligns with Alabama's specific regulations regarding its proximity to the Tennessee River. What is the most prudent course of action for the farmer and their advisor to ensure compliance with Alabama agricultural law? Option A. Proceed with the application as recommended by the manufacturer, assuming that EPA registration implies full compliance with all state-level agricultural laws. Option B. Thoroughly review the pesticide's specific label and consult the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries, ADI, regulations and guidance for Limestone County to confirm approved uses, application rates, and buffer zones near water bodies. Option C. Apply the pesticide at a slightly reduced rate to minimize potential environmental impact, even if it deviates from the label's instructions, to achieve a balance between yield and perceived risk. Option D. Rely on the advice of neighboring farmers who have used similar pesticides in the past, as their experience likely reflects current acceptable practices in Limestone County. The correct answer is B. Thoroughly review the pesticide's specific label and consult the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries, ADI regulations and guidance for Limestone County to confirm approved uses, application rates, and buffer zones near water bodies. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic pressures faced by a farmer with the long-term environmental and public health responsibilities mandated by Alabama's agricultural regulations. The farmer's desire to maximize profit by using a potentially harmful pesticide must be weighed against the legal obligations to protect water resources and ensure food safety. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing interests within the established legal framework. The best professional approach involves a thorough investigation of the pesticide's specific labeling requirements and the Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries, ADI regulations concerning its application. This includes verifying the approved uses, application rates, buffer zones, and any restrictions related to proximity to water bodies or specific crops. Consulting the ADI directly or reviewing their official guidance documents ensures compliance with the precise legal standards. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to the law, which is the ultimate determinant of permissible actions. Alabama law, through the ADI, sets forth the specific rules for pesticide use to protect public health and the environment, and any deviation from these rules carries legal consequences. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the pesticide manufacturer's general recommendations, without cross-referencing them with specific Alabama regulations. While manufacturers provide guidance, state-level regulations often impose stricter or more nuanced requirements based on local environmental conditions and agricultural practices. Failing to verify these state-specific mandates could lead to violations. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the application based on the farmer's perceived urgency and the belief that everyone does it this way. This subjective assessment ignores the legal framework and the potential for significant penalties if an inspection reveals noncompliance. Agricultural law in Alabama is designed to prevent harm, and anecdotal evidence or common practices do not supersede legal requirements. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to assume that if the pesticide is registered federally by the EPA, it is automatically permissible for all uses in Alabama without further state-level consideration. While EPA registration is a prerequisite, Alabama has its own regulatory authority to further restrict or regulate pesticide use within the state, to address specific local concerns. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of all applicable regulations, starting with the most specific and authoritative sources, such as state agricultural departments. This includes understanding the purpose behind the regulations, consulting official guidance, and seeking clarification from regulatory bodies when necessary. Prioritizing legal compliance and environmental stewardship over immediate economic expediency is crucial for responsible agricultural practice. Question 7. Operational review demonstrates a need to understand the historical underpinnings of Alabama agricultural law to advise a client on land use disputes. Which of the following best reflects the primary historical drivers that shaped early Alabama agricultural law? Option A. The development of complex international trade agreements impacting Alabama's agricultural exports. Option B. A singular focus on federal land grants and their subsequent subdivision for agricultural purposes. Option C. Establishing clear property rights, regulating land for farming, and addressing economic necessities of an agrarian society. Option D. The immediate and primary concern for environmental conservation and sustainable resource management from the outset. The correct answer is C. Establishing clear property rights, regulating land for farming, and addressing economic necessities of an agrarian society. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires understanding the foundational principles that shaped Alabama's agricultural law, particularly the transition from subsistence farming to more commercialized and regulated practices. A nuanced understanding of historical context is crucial for interpreting current statutes and advising clients effectively. The correct approach involves recognizing that early Alabama agricultural law was heavily influenced by the need to establish property rights, regulate land use for farming, and address issues arising from the agrarian economy of the time, including labor and market access. This historical development laid the groundwork for later federal and state interventions aimed at supporting farmers, ensuring food safety, and promoting sustainable practices. Understanding this evolution helps in discerning the legislative intent behind current regulations. An incorrect approach would be to assume that Alabama's agricultural law developed in isolation from broader national trends, or that its primary focus has always been on environmental conservation. While environmental concerns are now significant, they are a more recent development in the historical trajectory of agricultural law. Focusing solely on modern environmental regulations, without acknowledging the historical economic and property rights drivers, would lead to an incomplete and potentially misleading understanding of the legal landscape. Another incorrect approach would be to overemphasize the role of specific, isolated court cases, without considering the broader legislative and societal shifts that influenced agricultural practices and their legal governance in Alabama. While case law is important, the historical development of agricultural law is largely driven by legislative responses to economic, social, and technological changes. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to believe that Alabama's agricultural law has remained static since its inception, failing to adapt to changing economic conditions, technological advancements, and evolving societal values. Agricultural law is a dynamic field, and its historical development reflects continuous adaptation and reform. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core legal question, then researching the relevant historical context of Alabama's agricultural sector and its legal framework. This involves examining foundational statutes, legislative debates, and societal influences that shaped agricultural policy over time. Understanding this historical evolution provides a robust basis for interpreting current laws and predicting future legal trends. Question 8. Governance review demonstrates that a parcel of land in rural Alabama is owned by an individual who occasionally hunts on the property and has expressed a desire to potentially farm it in the future. The land is currently largely undeveloped woodland. Considering the specific definitions and requirements for agricultural property classification under Alabama law, which of the following best describes the property's classification? Option A. The property is classified as agricultural land because it is undeveloped woodland, which is a natural resource often associated with agricultural activities. Option B. The property is classified as agricultural land because the owner intends to farm it in the future and occasionally uses it for hunting. Option C. The property is classified as agricultural land if its primary and current use is for the production of agricultural commodities, such as crops, livestock, or timber, and it meets any applicable state-defined acreage or income requirements. Option D. The property is classified as agricultural land based on its potential for future agricultural development, regardless of its current use. The correct answer is C. The property is classified as agricultural land if its primary and current use is for the production of agricultural commodities, such as crops, livestock, or timber, and it meets any applicable state-defined acreage or income requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the classification of agricultural property in Alabama has significant legal and financial implications, particularly concerning zoning, taxation, and eligibility for specific agricultural programs. Misclassifying property can lead to noncompliance with Alabama's land use regulations and potentially result in penalties or loss of benefits. Careful judgment is required to accurately identify the primary use and characteristics of the land as defined by Alabama law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough examination of the property's primary use and its adherence to the definitions of agricultural land as outlined in Alabama's code, specifically Title 40, Chapter 10, which deals with property taxation and exemptions. This approach correctly identifies that land is considered agricultural if it is used primarily for the production of crops, livestock, or timber, and meets any acreage or income thresholds established by state law for preferential tax treatment. This aligns with the legislative intent to support and encourage active farming operations within the state. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves classifying the property solely based on the owner's stated intention, without verifying the actual use against Alabama's legal definitions. This fails to acknowledge that legal classification is based on objective criteria and demonstrable use, not subjective intent. It bypasses the regulatory framework that requires evidence of agricultural activity. Another incorrect approach is to classify the property based on its potential for agricultural use, even if it is currently undeveloped or used for recreational purposes. Alabama law typically requires current and primary use for agricultural classification, not speculative future use. This approach ignores the established legal standards for current land utilization. A further incorrect approach is to rely on general definitions of farmland without consulting specific Alabama statutes and local ordinances. While general knowledge can be a starting point, Alabama has specific criteria that must be met. Failing to consult these specific legal instruments leads to potential misclassification and noncompliance with state and local regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and factual accuracy. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant jurisdiction's laws and regulations, in this case, Alabama's code. 2. Gathering objective evidence of the property's current and primary use. 3. Comparing this evidence against the specific legal definitions and criteria provided by the jurisdiction. 4. Consulting with legal counsel or relevant state agencies if ambiguity exists. This systematic approach ensures that property is classified correctly according to established legal standards, thereby avoiding potential legal and financial repercussions. Question 9. The audit findings indicate that a farmer in Limestone County, Alabama, wishes to construct a new processing facility for their harvested crops adjacent to their existing farm. The farmer believes this is a standard agricultural expansion. What is the most appropriate initial step to ensure compliance with Alabama's land use regulations? Option A. Recommend that the farmer immediately apply for a variance from the Limestone County Zoning Board, as new construction often requires such approval. Option B. Review the Limestone County zoning ordinance and relevant sections of the Alabama Agricultural Code to determine the specific requirements for agricultural processing facilities in the farmer's designated zone. Option C. Assume that any structure directly related to farming is automatically permitted under all zoning classifications in Limestone County. Option D. Advise the farmer to proceed with construction, as processing facilities are generally considered a natural extension of agricultural operations under Alabama law. The correct answer is B. Review the Limestone County zoning ordinance and relevant sections of the Alabama Agricultural Code to determine the specific requirements for agricultural processing facilities in the farmer's designated zone. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential conflict between a farmer's desire to expand their agricultural operations and the existing zoning ordinances in Limestone County, Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the economic interests of the farmer with the community's land use planning objectives, which are governed by specific state and local regulations. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance and avoid legal repercussions. The best professional approach involves thoroughly reviewing the Limestone County zoning ordinance and the Alabama Agricultural Code to determine the specific regulations governing agricultural expansion within the farmer's designated zone. This includes identifying any permissible agricultural uses, setback requirements, or potential need for a special use permit or variance. Understanding the precise legal framework is paramount. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal requirements set forth by Limestone County and the state of Alabama, ensuring that any proposed expansion adheres to established land use controls. It prioritizes legal compliance and informed decision-making based on the applicable regulatory framework. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the expansion based solely on the farmer's understanding of general agricultural practices without consulting the specific Limestone County zoning ordinance. This fails to acknowledge the legally binding nature of local zoning regulations, which may impose restrictions beyond general agricultural norms. The regulatory failure lies in ignoring the specific land use controls enacted by Limestone County. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that any activity labeled agricultural is automatically permitted under all zoning classifications, regardless of specific ordinance provisions. This overlooks the fact that zoning ordinances often define and delineate permissible uses within different zones, and agricultural activities may be subject to specific limitations or conditions. The ethical and regulatory failure here is a misinterpretation of the scope and intent of zoning laws. A further incorrect approach would be to advise the farmer to seek a variance or special use permit without first conducting a comprehensive review of the ordinance to ascertain if the proposed expansion falls within a permitted use, or if such a process is even necessary. This could lead to unnecessary administrative burdens and costs for the farmer if the expansion is already permissible or if the grounds for a variance are not met. The professional failure is in providing premature or ill-informed advice. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific jurisdiction and relevant regulatory bodies, Limestone County Planning Department, Alabama Department of Agriculture and Industries. This is followed by a meticulous review of all applicable statutes, ordinances, and regulations. Next, gather all relevant facts about the proposed action. Then, analyze the facts against the regulatory framework to determine compliance. Finally, provide advice that is grounded in legal and regulatory requirements, clearly outlining permissible actions, necessary permits, and potential challenges. Question 10. Implementation of a mid-year rent adjustment in an agricultural lease in Alabama requires careful calculation. A farmer in Limestone County, Alabama, has a lease for 100 acres at an annual rent of $10,000 commencing January 1st. On July 1st, the lease is amended to increase the annual rent to $12,000 effective immediately. Assuming a non-leap year, what is the total rent due for that lease year? Option A, $11,000. Option B, $10,000. Option C, $11,500. Option D, $10,500. The correct answer is A, $11,000. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in agricultural leasing, accurately calculating and prorating rent when a lease term is modified mid-year. Professionals must navigate the specific terms of the lease agreement and Alabama law to ensure fair compensation and compliance. The challenge lies in interpreting the lease's provisions for rent adjustments and applying them correctly to a partial year's occupancy. The best approach involves a precise calculation of the prorated rent based on the agreed-upon terms for the partial year. This requires understanding the original rent, the new rent, and the exact number of days each rate is applicable within the lease year. The formula for prorating rent is original annual rent / 365 days, asterisk number of days at original rate plus new annual rent / 365 days, number of days at new rate. This method directly reflects the contractual agreement and ensures that the landlord receives rent proportional to the time the land was leased under each rate, adhering to the principles of contract law and fair dealing in Alabama. An incorrect approach would be to simply divide the total annual rent by 2 and apply it to each half of the year, regardless of the exact number of days the land was occupied under each rate. This fails to account for the precise duration of each rental period and can lead to either overcharging or undercharging the tenant, violating the lease terms and potentially Alabama contract law. Another incorrect approach is to apply the new rent rate for the entire lease year, even though the land was occupied under the original rate for a portion of that year. This disregards the contractual obligations for the period prior to the rent change and constitutes a breach of the lease agreement. A further incorrect approach is to round the number of days to the nearest month for calculation purposes. Agricultural leases, like most contracts, require precise adherence to the terms. Using approximations rather than exact day counts can lead to inaccuracies and disputes. Failing to uphold the contractual obligations as stipulated, professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes 1. Thoroughly reviewing the lease agreement for any clauses related to rent adjustments and proration. 2. Identifying the exact start and end dates for each rental rate within the lease year. 3. Applying the correct proration formula using the precise number of days for each rate. 4. Documenting all calculations and communications with the tenant. 5. Consulting Alabama statutes or legal counsel if lease terms are ambiguous. Question 11. To address the challenge of transferring ownership of a multi-acre farm in Alabama, which includes active crop leases and potential conservation easements, what is the most prudent course of action to ensure a legally sound and compliant transaction? Option A. Rely on a verbal agreement between the seller and buyer regarding the terms of the sale and the transfer of agricultural rights. Option B. Proceed with the transfer based on a quick review of general property records, assuming no specific agricultural restrictions apply. Option C. Execute a standard warranty deed without investigating or disclosing any specific agricultural covenants, crop leases, or potential conservation easements. Option D. Conduct a thorough title search, review all existing agricultural leases and conservation easements, and ensure all transfer documents strictly adhere to Alabama code provisions for real property and agricultural land transfers. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough title search, review all existing agricultural leases and conservation easements, and ensure all transfer documents strictly adhere to Alabama code provisions for real property and agricultural land transfers. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in agricultural law, navigating the complexities of transferring ownership of farmland while ensuring compliance with Alabama's specific property and agricultural regulations. The challenge lies in balancing the seller's desire for a straightforward transaction with the buyer's need for clear title, and the state's interest in preserving agricultural land and its productivity. Careful judgment is required to identify potential encumbrances, ensure proper documentation, and adhere to statutory requirements for land transfers in Alabama. The best approach involves a comprehensive due diligence process that prioritizes legal and regulatory compliance. This includes conducting a thorough title search to identify any existing liens, easements, or other encumbrances that could affect the buyer's ownership rights. It also necessitates reviewing existing agricultural leases, conservation easements, and any relevant agricultural district designations under Alabama law. Furthermore, ensuring that all transfer documents, such as the deed and any associated agricultural use agreements, are drafted in strict accordance with Alabama code provisions governing real property transfers and agricultural land is paramount. This meticulous approach minimizes the risk of future disputes, protects the buyer's investment, and upholds the integrity of agricultural land transactions within the state. An approach that solely relies on a verbal agreement between the parties for the transfer of agricultural property is professionally unacceptable. Alabama law requires real estate transfers to be in writing and properly executed to be legally binding. Relying on a verbal agreement fails to meet the statute of frauds requirements for land transactions, leaving both parties vulnerable to disputes and making the transfer unenforceable. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to proceed with the transfer based on a cursory review of existing property records without investigating specific agricultural considerations. Alabama has laws and programs related to agricultural land preservation and use. Failing to investigate potential agricultural easements, conservation restrictions, or agricultural district status could lead to the buyer acquiring property with limitations they were unaware of, potentially impacting their intended use and violating state agricultural policy objectives. Proceeding with the transfer by only executing a standard warranty deed without addressing any specific agricultural covenants or restrictions is also professionally unsound. While a warranty deed provides certain assurances, it does not inherently address the unique aspects of agricultural property, such as existing crop liens, water rights crucial for farming, or specific agricultural zoning requirements that might be in place under Alabama law. This oversight can lead to significant legal and financial complications for the buyer post-transfer. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's objectives and then systematically identifies all relevant legal and regulatory requirements. This involves a proactive approach to due diligence, seeking expert advice when necessary, e.g., from an agricultural economist or a title insurance specialist, and ensuring all documentation accurately reflects the agreement and complies with all applicable state laws, particularly those pertaining to real property and agriculture in Alabama. Question 12. The review process indicates that a cotton farmer in Alabama has received a proposed contract for the sale of their upcoming harvest. The farmer is familiar with general business practices, but has limited experience with agricultural commodity contracts. Which of the following actions represents the most prudent and legally sound approach for the farmer to take before signing the contract? Option A. Sign the contract after a quick review of the price per pound and the delivery date, assuming the rest of the terms are standard and fair. Option B. Rely on the advice of a neighboring farmer who has sold cotton for many years to interpret the contract's provisions. Option C. Accept the buyer's assurances that the contract is a standard document and that no further review is necessary. Option D. Engage an attorney licensed to practice law in Alabama, who specializes in agricultural law, to review the contract and advise on its terms and implications. The correct answer is D. Engage an attorney licensed to practice law in Alabama, who specializes in agricultural law, to review the contract and advise on its terms and implications. Explanation. The review process indicates a scenario where a farmer in Alabama is presented with a contract for the sale of their cotton crop. This situation is professionally challenging because agricultural contracts, while seemingly straightforward, involve complex legal considerations that can significantly impact the farmer's livelihood. Misunderstanding or neglecting key contractual terms can lead to financial losses, disputes, and even legal action. The farmer must exercise careful judgment to ensure the contract is fair, legally sound, and aligns with their best interests under Alabama law. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of the contract by an attorney specializing in agricultural law in Alabama. This approach is correct because it leverages expert legal knowledge to identify potential risks and ensure compliance with Alabama's specific contract laws and agricultural regulations. An attorney can explain the implications of clauses related to pricing, delivery, quality standards, force majeure, and dispute resolution, safeguarding the farmer against unfavorable terms and potential breaches. This proactive measure aligns with the ethical duty to act in the client's best interest and the legal requirement to understand and consent to contractual obligations. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the buyer's assurances without independent legal counsel. This is professionally unacceptable because it exposes the farmer to significant risk. The buyer's representative is acting in their employer's interest, not the farmer's, and may not fully disclose or even be aware of all legal implications. This failure to seek expert advice violates the principle of informed consent and could lead to the farmer agreeing to terms that are detrimental or legally unenforceable under Alabama law, such as clauses that unfairly shift risk or limit liability in ways not permitted by state statutes. Another incorrect approach is to sign the contract based on a cursory review of a few key clauses, assuming the rest are standard. This is professionally unsound, as it neglects the intricate details that often contain hidden liabilities or opportunities. Alabama contract law requires a meeting of the minds on all material terms. Overlooking specific provisions related to crop insurance, arbitration, or payment schedules can result in misunderstandings and disputes that are costly and time-consuming to resolve, potentially leading to litigation. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to rely on advice from a neighbor or a general business advisor who lacks specific expertise in agricultural law in Alabama. While well-intentioned, such advice may not be legally accurate or relevant to the nuances of agricultural contracts in the state. This can lead to decisions based on incomplete or incorrect information, failing to address specific Alabama statutes governing agricultural sales, such as those pertaining to commodity sales or lien rights, thereby jeopardizing the farmer's legal standing and financial security. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes due diligence and expert consultation. This involves 1. Identifying the core objective, selling the cotton crop. 2. Recognizing the inherent risks associated with contractual agreements, especially in a specialized field like agriculture. 3. Actively seeking out and engaging qualified legal counsel with specific expertise in Alabama agricultural law. 4. Thoroughly understanding all contractual terms and their implications before execution. 5. Documenting all advice and decisions. Question 13. Examination of the data shows that a farm in rural Alabama is experiencing increased nutrient and sediment runoff into a nearby creek following recent heavy rainfall. The farmer is concerned about potential regulatory scrutiny from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, but is unsure of the best course of action to ensure compliance with Alabama's pollution control regulations. Option A. Continue current farming practices, focusing on maximizing crop yield, and address any potential environmental concerns only if formal enforcement action is taken by ADEM. Option B. Immediately contact the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, to report the runoff, inquire about specific best management practices for agricultural operations in Alabama, and explore any available technical or financial assistance programs for compliance. Option C. Assume the runoff is a temporary consequence of unusual weather and monitor the situation without taking further action unless ADEM initiates an inquiry. Option D. Implement changes to farm operations based on advice received from neighboring farmers who have experienced similar runoff issues in the past. The correct answer is B. Immediately contact the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, to report the runoff, inquire about specific best management practices for agricultural operations in Alabama, and explore any available technical or financial assistance programs for compliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing agricultural productivity with environmental protection under Alabama's specific pollution control regulations. The farmer's actions, while potentially driven by economic necessity or a lack of awareness, could lead to significant environmental harm and legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to identify the most compliant and responsible course of action. The best approach involves proactively engaging with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, to understand the specific requirements for managing agricultural runoff and to explore available compliance assistance programs. This proactive engagement demonstrates a commitment to environmental stewardship and allows for the development of a tailored compliance strategy that addresses the unique characteristics of the farm's operations and the local watershed. Alabama's environmental laws, particularly those administered by ADEM, emphasize prevention and control of pollution from agricultural sources, including nutrient and sediment runoff. By consulting with ADEM, the farmer can ensure their practices align with the Alabama Water Pollution Control Act and related regulations, thereby avoiding potential violations and penalties. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the observed runoff as a minor issue or a natural occurrence without further investigation or consultation. This ignores the potential for cumulative environmental damage and the legal obligations under Alabama law to prevent pollution. Another incorrect approach is to implement changes based solely on anecdotal advice from other farmers without verifying compliance with ADEM regulations. This could lead to ineffective mitigation strategies or even new violations. Finally, continuing the current practices without any attempt to assess or mitigate the runoff would be a clear violation of Alabama's pollution control framework, which places responsibility on agricultural operations to manage their environmental impact. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and environmental responsibility. This involves 1. Identifying potential environmental risks associated with current operations. 2. Researching and understanding all applicable state and federal environmental regulations, in this case, Alabama's specific laws and ADEM guidelines. 3. Consulting with regulatory agencies for clarification and guidance. 4. Developing and implementing a compliance plan that addresses identified risks. 5. Regularly monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of implemented measures. Question 14. Upon reviewing the pesticide application protocols for a large-scale cotton farm in Alabama, the farm manager notices that while the pesticide manufacturer's label provides instructions for use, the farm's current training program for employees who handle these chemicals is limited to a brief overview of the label. The manager is concerned about ensuring full compliance with Occupational Safety and Health Administration (OSHA) regulations regarding worker protection from hazardous chemicals. Which of the following approaches best addresses this concern? Option A. Implement a comprehensive training program that covers specific pesticide hazards, safe handling procedures, emergency response, and the correct use and maintenance of personal protective equipment, PPE, ensuring all employees understand the safety data sheets, SDS, for each chemical. Option B. Rely solely on the pesticide manufacturer's label instructions, assuming that employees will understand and follow them accurately for all aspects of mixing, loading, and application. Option C. Assume that since the pesticides are registered for agricultural use in Alabama, they are safe for all workers without the need for additional specific training beyond what is provided on the label. Option D. Prioritize cost savings by providing only the minimum required PPE, and only when specifically requested by an employee, rather than proactively ensuring its consistent and correct use. The correct answer is A. Implement a comprehensive training program that covers specific pesticide hazards, safe handling procedures, emergency response, and the correct use and maintenance of personal protective equipment, PPE, ensuring all employees understand the safety data sheets, SDS, for each chemical. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for agricultural operations in Alabama, balancing the need for efficient pest control with the imperative to protect workers from hazardous chemical exposure, as mandated by OSHA regulations. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and applying complex safety standards to a dynamic work environment where risks can change rapidly. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance without unduly hindering essential farming operations. The best approach involves a proactive and comprehensive safety program that prioritizes worker training and the use of appropriate personal protective equipment, PPE, when handling pesticides. This includes ensuring all employees who mix, load, or apply pesticides receive thorough training on the specific hazards of the chemicals used, proper handling techniques, emergency procedures, and the correct use and maintenance of PPE. Furthermore, maintaining readily accessible safety data sheets, SDS, for all pesticides and ensuring workers understand how to interpret them is a critical component of this approach. This aligns directly with OSHA Hazard Communication Standard, 29 CFR 1910, 1200, and specific pesticide application regulations, which emphasize worker education and protection. An approach that relies solely on the pesticide manufacturer's label instructions without supplementary training or specific site risk assessments is insufficient. While the label provides essential information, it may not cover all site-specific risks or ensure that workers fully comprehend the instructions, especially for individuals with varying literacy levels or language barriers. This failure to provide comprehensive training and ensure understanding constitutes a regulatory gap. Another unacceptable approach is to assume that because a pesticide is registered for agricultural use, it is inherently safe for all workers under all conditions without proper precautions. This overlooks the specific requirements of OSHA regarding worker protection from hazardous substances, which necessitates active measures to mitigate risks beyond mere product registration. Finally, an approach that delays or avoids providing necessary PPE due to cost or perceived inconvenience is a direct violation of OSHA standards. The employer has a legal and ethical obligation to provide and ensure the use of appropriate PPE to protect workers from recognized hazards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough hazard assessment for all pesticide-related tasks. This assessment should inform the development of a written safety program that includes detailed training protocols, clear procedures for PPE selection and use, and regular review and updates based on new information or changes in operations. Continuous communication with workers about potential hazards and safety measures is also paramount. Question 15. When evaluating a verbal agreement for the sale of 500 bushels of soybeans between an Alabama farmer and a local grain buyer, what is the most crucial step to determine if a legally binding contract exists under Alabama law? Option A. Concluding that no valid contract can exist because the agreement was not put in writing. Option B. Ascertaining whether a clear offer to sell, an unequivocal acceptance, and a bargain for exchange of consideration were present, along with mutual assent and a lawful purpose. Option C. Focusing solely on whether both parties intended to conduct business, regardless of specific terms. Option D. Assuming a contract exists because the farmer and buyer have a history of doing business together. The correct answer is B. Ascertaining whether a clear offer to sell, an unequivocal acceptance, and a bargain for exchange of consideration were present, along with mutual assent and a lawful purpose. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in agricultural transactions within Alabama, ensuring that informal agreements, particularly those involving the sale of crops, meet the legal requirements for a valid contract. The difficulty lies in distinguishing a legally binding agreement from a mere expression of intent or a preliminary discussion. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to protect their clients' interests and avoid potential disputes arising from unenforceable agreements. The absence of a written document and the reliance on verbal communication necessitate a thorough understanding of contract formation principles under Alabama law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves identifying whether the essential elements of a valid contract are present in the verbal agreement between the farmer and the buyer. Under Alabama law, these elements are offer, acceptance, consideration, mutual assent, a meeting of the minds, and a lawful purpose. Specifically, this means confirming that the farmer clearly offered to sell a specific quantity of soybeans at an agreed-upon price, and the buyer unequivocally accepted that offer. Furthermore, there must be a bargain for exchange consideration, such as the farmer's promise to deliver the soybeans in exchange for the buyer's promise to pay the agreed price. Both parties must have intended to be bound by the agreement, and the subject matter sale of soybeans must be legal. This approach directly addresses the core legal requirements for contract validity in Alabama. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that any verbal agreement, especially in established business relationships, is automatically a valid and enforceable contract. This overlooks the critical requirement of demonstrating all necessary contractual elements. Alabama law does not presume contract validity based solely on a prior relationship or a casual conversation. Another flawed approach is to focus solely on the intention of the parties to do business, without verifying if a specific offer and acceptance occurred, and if consideration was exchanged. While intent is important for mutual assent, it is not a substitute for the concrete elements of offer, acceptance, and consideration. Finally, an approach that dismisses the agreement because it lacks a written document is also incorrect. While written contracts are highly advisable for clarity and proof, Alabama law recognizes valid oral contracts, provided all essential elements can be proven. The absence of writing does not automatically invalidate an agreement, but it makes proving its existence and terms more challenging. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework when evaluating the validity of an alleged contract, especially in verbal agreements. First, they must clearly identify the alleged terms of the agreement: what was offered, what was accepted, and what was exchanged. Second, they must assess each of the essential elements of a contract under Alabama law: offer, acceptance, consideration, mutual assent, lawful purpose, against the identified terms. Third, they should consider the evidence available to prove each element, recognizing that verbal agreements require more robust proof. Finally, they should advise their client based on a clear understanding of whether a legally enforceable contract likely exists, and what steps, if any, are necessary to protect their interests. Question 16. In Alabama, a landowner enters into an agreement with a farmer for the cultivation of a cotton crop. The agreement stipulates that the farmer will provide all labor, machinery, and management for the farming operation. The landowner will provide the land. Upon harvest, The crop will be divided equally between the landowner and the farmer, with each party responsible for selling their respective share. The landowner retains no control over the farming methods or the timing of planting and harvesting. Based on these terms, what is the most accurate classification of this agricultural contract under Alabama law? Option A, a lease agreement where the farmer pays rent in the form of a share of the crop. Option B, a sharecropping agreement where the farmer is an independent contractor. Option C, a partnership agreement for the joint cultivation of the land. Option D, a fixed-term employment contract for agricultural labor. The correct answer is A, a lease agreement where the farmer pays rent in the form of a share of the crop. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of different agricultural contract types under Alabama law, specifically distinguishing between a lease agreement and a sharecropping arrangement. Mischaracterizing the agreement can lead to significant legal and financial repercussions for both the landowner and the farmer, including disputes over ownership of crops, rental payments, and potential violations of agricultural labor laws. Careful judgment is required to accurately classify the arrangement based on the specific terms and the allocation of risk and reward. The best approach involves carefully examining the agreement's provisions regarding the division of the crop and the farmer's level of control over the farming operations. A true lease agreement in Alabama typically involves the farmer paying a fixed rent, either in cash or a portion of the crop, and retaining control over the farming methods and the disposition of the harvested crop. The landowner's role is primarily that of a lessor, receiving rent without direct involvement in the day-to-day farming decisions or a share in the profits beyond the agreed-upon rent. This aligns with the legal definition of a lease, which grants possession and use of the land for a specified period in exchange for rent. An incorrect approach would be to classify the agreement solely based on the fact that the farmer provides labor and management. These are characteristics of a sharecropping arrangement. They are also present in some lease agreements where the farmer is responsible for all operational aspects. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the landowner's receipt of a portion of the crop, without considering the underlying control and risk allocation. In Alabama, sharecropping typically involves the landowner sharing in the risks and profits of the farming operation, often dictating certain farming practices and having a direct stake in the success of the crop beyond a fixed rental payment. Misclassifying this as a lease would ignore the shared risk and profit element inherent in sharecropping. Furthermore, assuming the agreement is a lease simply because it is labeled as such is a critical error. The substance of the agreement, not its title, determines its legal classification under Alabama law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough review of the contract's terms, focusing on the allocation of responsibilities, risks, and rewards between the parties. This includes analyzing how the crop is divided, who bears the costs of production, who makes the farming decisions, and how the proceeds from the sale of the crop are distributed. Comparing these elements against the established legal definitions of lease agreements and sharecropping arrangements in Alabama is crucial for accurate classification. Question 17. Comparative studies suggest that when agricultural producers encounter issues with the quality of delivered goods, their response significantly impacts contractual outcomes. In Alabama, a soybean farmer has entered into a contract for the sale of a specific quantity of soybeans to a feed mill. Upon delivery, the farmer suspects that the soybeans are of a lower grade than specified in the contract, exhibiting signs of mold and insect damage. What is the most appropriate course of action for the farmer to take to protect their rights and fulfill their contractual obligations under Alabama law? Option A. Publicly accuse the feed mill of intentionally accepting substandard goods and attempting to defraud the farmer without first conducting a formal inspection or seeking legal counsel. Option B. Immediately resell the soybeans to another buyer without informing the feed mill of the suspected defects, hoping to recoup some of the potential losses. Option C. Continue to store and use the soybeans for a period while contemplating the best course of action, and then inform the feed mill of the issues. Option D. Promptly conduct a thorough inspection of the delivered soybeans to document the extent of mold and insect damage, and then provide the feed mill with timely and specific written notice detailing the nonconformities and the basis for rejection. Correct answer is D. Promptly conduct a thorough inspection of the delivered soybeans to document the extent of mold and insect damage, and then provide the feed mill with timely and specific written notice detailing the nonconformities and the basis for rejection. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a potential breach of contract and a dispute over the quality of goods delivered, which can lead to financial losses for both parties and damage to business relationships. Navigating these situations requires a thorough understanding of Alabama's Uniform Commercial Code, UC, as it applies to sales of goods, particularly concerning acceptance, rejection, and remedies for breach. Careful judgment is required to ensure that actions taken are legally sound and ethically responsible, protecting the rights of both the buyer and the seller. The best professional approach involves a systematic and documented process of inspection and communication. Upon discovering the alleged defects, the buyer should promptly and thoroughly inspect the delivered soybeans to determine the extent and nature of the nonconformity. This inspection should be conducted in a manner that preserves the evidence of the defect. Following the inspection, the buyer must provide timely and specific notice of the alleged defects to the seller, clearly outlining the nature of the nonconformity and the basis for rejection. This aligns with Alabama UCC Section 2-602, which requires rejection to be within a reasonable time after delivery and seasonable notification to the seller. This approach ensures transparency, allows the seller an opportunity to cure any defects if possible, Alabama UCC Section 2-508, and establishes a clear record for any subsequent dispute resolution, thereby upholding contractual obligations and legal requirements. An approach that involves immediately reselling the soybeans without proper inspection or notification to the seller is professionally unacceptable. This action bypasses the buyer's obligation to inspect and reject nonconforming goods under Alabama UCC Section 2-601 and Section 2-602. Failing to notify the seller of the defects deprives the seller of the opportunity to cure the problem, potentially leading to a wrongful rejection claim against the buyer. Furthermore, immediate resale without clear documentation of the defects and communication with the seller can be construed as acceptance of the goods, obligating the buyer to pay the contract price. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to delay notification of the defects for an extended period while continuing to use the soybeans. This delay violates the requirement for seasonable notification under Alabama UCC Section 2-602. Such a delay can be interpreted as acceptance of the goods, even if they are non-conforming, as per Alabama UCC Section 2-606. The buyer may then be precluded from rejecting the goods or may only be able to claim damages for breach of warranty, which is a less advantageous position than timely rejection. Finally, an approach that involves making unsubstantiated accusations of fraud against the seller without concrete evidence or a proper inspection process is also professionally unsound. While disputes can arise, resorting to accusations of fraud without following the established legal procedures for inspecting and rejecting goods under the UCC can lead to legal repercussions for the buyer, including defamation claims, and undermines the principles of good faith and fair dealing required in commercial transactions under Alabama law. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes clear communication, thorough documentation, and adherence to statutory requirements. This involves understanding the contractual terms, consulting relevant state laws, in this case, Alabama's UCC, conducting prompt and objective assessments of any issues, and engaging in good faith negotiations or formal dispute resolution processes as necessary. Question 18. The investigation demonstrates that a farmer in rural Alabama is experiencing a dispute with a neighboring landowner regarding the exact boundary line between their respective agricultural properties. The farmer believes the current fence line, which has been in place for several decades, accurately reflects the historical boundary, but the neighbor is asserting a different boundary based on their understanding of older property markers. What is the most appropriate course of action for the farmer to take to resolve this property law issue in Alabama? Option A. Propose to the neighbor that they jointly move the fence to a location that appears to be a reasonable compromise without obtaining professional surveys or legal advice. Option B. Immediately file a lawsuit against the neighbor to have a court officially determine the boundary line without further investigation. Option C. Rely on the farmer's memory and the long-standing presence of the fence as definitive proof of the boundary, and inform the neighbor that the fence line is the established boundary. Option D. Obtain a certified land survey from a licensed Alabama surveyor, review all relevant property deeds and title history, and consult with an attorney experienced in Alabama real estate law to determine the legally recognized boundary. Correct answer is D. Obtain a certified land survey from a licensed Alabama surveyor, review all relevant property deeds and title history, and consult with an attorney experienced in Alabama real estate law to determine the legally recognized boundary. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a potential boundary dispute concerning agricultural land in Alabama, which can have significant legal and financial ramifications for the involved parties. Determining the precise legal boundaries of property is crucial for establishing ownership rights, preventing encroachment, and ensuring compliance with Alabama property law. Careful judgment is required to navigate the complexities of land surveys, historical deeds, and potential adverse possession claims. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of all relevant legal documentation and the engagement of qualified professionals. This includes obtaining a certified land survey conducted by a licensed Alabama surveyor, meticulously examining the chain of title for both properties, and consulting with an attorney specializing in Alabama real estate and agricultural law. This comprehensive approach ensures that all legal avenues are explored, potential disputes are addressed based on established legal principles and documented evidence, and any resolution is legally sound and defensible under Alabama law. This aligns with the ethical obligation to provide accurate and well-supported advice based on the specific legal framework of Alabama. An approach that relies solely on the farmer's recollection of past fence lines is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge the legal weight of official surveys and deeds, and it ignores the possibility of historical inaccuracies or shifts in boundaries over time. Alabama property law requires objective evidence for boundary determination, not anecdotal accounts. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to immediately initiate legal action without first gathering all necessary evidence and attempting informal resolution. This can escalate the situation unnecessarily, incur significant costs, and may not be the most effective way to resolve a boundary dispute, especially if a clear legal boundary can be established through surveying and title review. Alabama law encourages the resolution of disputes through evidence-based means before resorting to litigation. Finally, an approach that involves unilaterally moving the fence based on a perceived boundary, without a formal survey or legal consultation, is also professionally unsound. This action could be construed as trespass or encroachment, leading to legal liability and further complicating the dispute. Alabama property law protects established property rights, and unilateral actions can violate these rights. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes evidence gathering, legal consultation, and adherence to established legal procedures. This involves 1. Understanding the client's concerns and the nature of the dispute. 2. Identifying and gathering all relevant documentation, deeds, surveys, tax records. 3. Consulting with licensed professionals, surveyors, attorneys to interpret the evidence and advise on legal options. 4. Exploring informal resolution methods where appropriate. 5. Proceeding with formal legal action only when necessary and based on solid legal grounds. Question 19. A farmer in rural Alabama is considering adopting a new, technologically advanced irrigation system that utilizes treated wastewater. While the system promises significant water savings and cost reductions, the farmer is uncertain about the specific Alabama state regulations governing the use of treated wastewater for agricultural irrigation, potential environmental impacts, and any necessary permits. What is the most prudent and legally sound approach for the farmer to take in Alabama to ensure compliance and mitigate risks? Option A. Postpone the adoption of the new system until specific regulations for treated wastewater irrigation in Alabama are clearly established and widely publicized. Option B. Rely on advice from neighboring farmers who have experience with similar irrigation technologies and consult general online resources about water usage regulations. Option C. Engage an attorney specializing in Alabama agricultural law to review the proposed irrigation system, advise on all applicable state and federal regulations, and assist with any necessary permitting processes. Option D. Assume that existing general environmental regulations for water discharge are sufficient and proceed with the installation, addressing any issues if they arise later. The correct answer is C. Engage an attorney specializing in Alabama agricultural law to review the proposed irrigation system, advise on all applicable state and federal regulations, and assist with any necessary permitting processes. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities and evolving nature of agricultural practices in Alabama, coupled with the critical need for producers to understand and comply with relevant state and federal laws. The rapid pace of technological advancement in agriculture, such as precision farming and genetically modified organisms, often outpaces the development of specific regulations, creating gray areas where established legal principles must be applied to novel situations. Furthermore, the economic pressures faced by farmers necessitate efficient operations, which can sometimes create a temptation to overlook or misinterpret legal requirements if the immediate consequences are not apparent. Careful judgment is required to balance operational needs with legal obligations, ensuring long-term sustainability and avoiding potential penalties or liabilities. The best approach involves proactively seeking comprehensive legal counsel from an attorney specializing in Alabama agricultural law. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the need for expert interpretation of the intricate web of regulations governing agricultural operations in Alabama. Such an attorney can provide tailored advice on compliance with specific statutes like the Alabama Agricultural Code, environmental regulations concerning water rights and pesticide use, labor laws applicable to farm workers, and land use regulations. This ensures that decisions are made within the bounds of the law, mitigating risks of fines, lawsuits, and operational disruptions. It aligns with the ethical duty of professionals to act with competence and diligence, ensuring that clients are fully informed of their legal obligations and rights. An approach that relies solely on informal advice from other farmers or industry peers is professionally unacceptable. While peer experience can be valuable for operational insights, it is not a substitute for legal expertise. This approach fails because informal advice may be based on incomplete understanding, outdated information, or specific circumstances that do not apply to the current situation. It lacks the authoritative interpretation of Alabama statutes and regulations necessary for legal compliance. Furthermore, relying on such advice could lead to violations of specific Alabama agricultural laws, such as those pertaining to soil conservation, animal welfare, or the marketing of agricultural products, resulting in penalties. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that existing general business laws are sufficient to cover all agricultural operations without specific review. This is incorrect because Alabama has a distinct body of agricultural law that addresses unique issues such as crop insurance, agricultural liens, and specific environmental protections for farmland that are not covered by general business statutes. Ignoring these specific provisions can lead to noncompliance with regulations like those governing the use of restricted-use pesticides or the proper disposal of agricultural waste, potentially resulting in significant environmental damage and legal repercussions under Alabama's environmental statutes. Finally, adopting a wait-and-see attitude, hoping that any potential legal issues will resolve themselves or that enforcement will be lenient, is also professionally unacceptable. This passive approach ignores the proactive nature required for legal compliance. It can lead to the accumulation of violations, making future compliance more difficult and costly. It also exposes the operation to potential legal action for noncompliance with Alabama's agricultural regulations, which can include fines, injunctions, and even criminal charges in severe cases, undermining the long-term viability of the agricultural enterprise. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific legal landscape of Alabama's agricultural sector. This involves identifying all relevant federal, state, and local laws and regulations. The next step is to assess how these regulations apply to the specific agricultural activities being undertaken. When faced with uncertainty or novel situations, the framework dictates seeking expert legal advice from qualified professionals specializing in agricultural law within the relevant jurisdiction. This ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and ethically sound, promoting responsible agricultural practices and protecting the long-term interests of the operation. Question 20. Consider a scenario where a utility company in Alabama requires a 15-foot wide permanent easement across a 100-acre parcel of prime agricultural land used for row crop farming. The easement will run along the northern edge of the property, reducing the cultivable area by 25 acres. The farmer estimates that due to the easement, they will need to purchase specialized equipment to navigate around the new obstruction, costing $25,000 and that the annual yield from the remaining 75 acres will be reduced by an average of 5% due to altered field patterns and potential soil compaction issues. The fair market value of the unimproved agricultural land is $5,000 per acre. The farmer's projected annual gross revenue from the entire 100 acres before the easement was $100,000. Calculate the minimum fair compensation the farmer should receive for the easement, considering the loss of land, the cost of new equipment, and the projected annual loss in revenue over a 20-year period, assuming the annual revenue loss remains constant. Option A, $145,000. Option B, $75,000. Option C, $125,000. Option D, $100,000. The correct answer is A, $145,000. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the precise calculation of compensation for an easement, directly impacting the financial interests of both the landowner and the entity acquiring the right-of-way. Miscalculation can lead to legal disputes, financial loss, and damage to professional reputation. The core of the challenge lies in accurately valuing the diminished use and enjoyment of the agricultural land due to the easement, considering Alabama's specific legal framework for eminent domain and property valuation. The best approach involves a thorough assessment of the easement's impact on the agricultural productivity and market value of the remaining land, using established appraisal methodologies. This includes calculating the loss of acreage, the cost of relocating or adapting farming operations, and any long-term reduction in the land's income-generating potential. The compensation should be based on the fair market value of the property taken and the damages to the remainder, as generally understood in Alabama eminent domain law, which aims to make the landowner whole. This method directly addresses the legal requirement to compensate for both the property interest acquired and any consequential damages. An incorrect approach would be to simply calculate compensation based on the per-acre market value of the land, without considering the specific impact on its agricultural use. This fails to account for the unique challenges and potential losses faced by a farmer, such as the inability to cultivate certain areas, the need for specialized equipment to navigate around the easement, or the disruption to irrigation systems. Alabama law requires compensation for the actual damages incurred, not just a superficial valuation. Another incorrect approach is to base compensation solely on the cost of the easement to the acquiring entity, such as the cost of materials and labor for the infrastructure. This method ignores the landowner's loss of use and enjoyment of their property, which is a fundamental aspect of property rights and compensation under Alabama law. The focus must be on the landowner's detriment, not the acquirer's expense. Finally, an approach that relies on a subjective estimation of damages without supporting data or appraisal expertise is also professionally unacceptable. This lacks objectivity and can be easily challenged in court, failing to meet the legal standard for fair compensation. Professionals must employ objective, data-driven methods to ensure fairness and compliance with legal requirements. The professional decision-making process for such situations should involve 1. Understanding the specific legal requirements for easements and eminent domain in Alabama. 2. Engaging qualified appraisers to conduct a comprehensive valuation of the easement's impact. 3. Documenting all calculations and assumptions meticulously. 4. Negotiating in good faith, based on sound financial and legal principles. 5. Being prepared to justify the valuation through expert testimony if necessary.